Good evening, everyone. I would like to, before introducing our speaker tonight, I would like to say a few words in memory of our benefactor, the person who gave his name to this center, Vidal Sassoon, who passed away approximately 2 weeks ago. And he was somebody rather exceptional in the Jewish world insofar as he made his fortune in a completely different line of business. Some of you may recall the fact that Vidal Sassoon became an international celebrity back in the swinging 60s, as they were called. I actually lived through them, so I can say that it was a bit of a myth, but nevertheless, swinging London, where I grew up and where Vidal Sassoon came from, was perhaps a little less of a myth. He made his name and his fortune in the area of cutting hair, and he turned it into an art form. In fact, his style, even to this day, is renowned. And he belongs to that world which is now gone, of Mary Quant, of Beatlemania, of the fashion models, a glamorous, stylish world. And what's unusual about this man, and a very good reason to remember him now, is that after he had made his fortune, he never forgot his roots. His roots, and that's not a pun on his occupation, but his roots were actually in the East End of London. He grew up during the Great Depression, and he was sent to a Jewish orphanage at a very early age because he grew up in a one-parent family in grinding poverty. And one of the most formative experiences of his life, which he spoke about both in private conversation and also publicly, was in the immediate post-war era when he was a young adolescent, 16 or 17 years old. He fought on the streets of East London against the black shirts, the followers of Sir Oswald Mosley, the fascists, who thought that they might have a revival of their fortunes. And then in 1948, at the age of 20, he volunteered for the Palmach and fought in Israel's War of Independence, a most unusual thing for a young British Jew to do at that time. I won't elaborate further for the simple reason that our center intends to hold an evening in his memory, hopefully around the 7th of June. Perhaps that may turn out to be too early, but please watch out for that date, because I think that this is a man who deserves really to be remembered. If I have to think of a possible link between Vidal and the subject of tonight's lecture, Emile Zola, I can think of at least two things. One is that both of them, in very different ways, were fighters. And they were fighters in a cause which is still very much with us, and which is part of the raison d'etre both of this institute, named after Vidal Sassoon, and also the new institute, relatively new institute at Yale University, from whose director you will be hearing in a few minutes. The battle against anti-Semitism is a long and difficult one, probably an unending. Vidal certainly recognized that as a result of his experiences in the East End of London. Emile Zola discovered it in ways that you will surely learn about tonight, and was I think, deeply shaken and shocked by what he came to experience in the last decade of the 19th century in France. Of course, there were also great differences. Vidal was someone who left school at 14, who was not an articulate intellectual and distrusted intellectuals, which is something I can certainly understand. Emile Zola, I think, not only deserves the title, in the sense, in an honorary sense, title of intellectual, but much more than that, we could make an argument that he actually opened the breach through which, subsequently, and through the 20th century, many intellectuals with varying degrees of success have entered. Some might argue that the birth of the modern intellectual took place during the Dreyfus affair, and in the immediate aftermath of Emile Zola's ringing and unforgettable J'accuse in January 1898, because only a day after that historic and explosive letter, open letter to the President of the Republic, the French Republic, appeared the first protestation des intellectuels, the first protest of the intellectuals. So it was Zola who sparked the entry into the public realm of the modern intellectuals. I think the Dreyfus affair, on balance, although things are not so simple as they seem, on balance, was a more triumphal story of an intervention by intellectuals. There were many far more disastrous episodes that would follow through the 20th century. So Zola, and one of the reasons why I'm particularly happy that tonight we can discuss this issue, Zola has entered history, rightly, as someone who not only opened the door for a more public and, if you like, moral role of the intellectual, but Zola was somebody who really committed himself at great cost, personal cost, to the battle against anti-Semitism and the wider struggle for human rights and justice. And I think he didn't really separate these issues, and perhaps we need to think of ways, more innovative and creative ways, in which we can restore something of a universal dimension to the struggle for Jewish rights and against anti-Semitism. Two final points. I think that Zola is first and foremost, and certainly for students of French literature, of European letters, Zola is a great novelist. And I'm sure we will hear something tonight concerning that side of his activity. And at first glance, it might appear odd, surprising, strange, that a man incredibly productive as he was, with this huge literary oeuvre, and a man who in many ways detested and despised politics, should have actually, more than any other single individual at that moment in time, transformed the political situation in France. One of those ironies of history, perhaps. But the relationship between literature and politics is a fascinating one, and this is a particularly intriguing example. The other issue is something that increasingly has preoccupied me since I've been in this position, and more perhaps publicly involved than at any previous time, in the question of how do you engage people in the contemporary issues of anti-Semitism. And I remember something that I actually heard from Vidal Sassoon, but it echoed my own feeling over a long period of time. And I find it distressing, but I feel the need to make the point here. I feel that in our time, at this moment, that people in academia, and more widely in the intellectual world, have failed. Failed in their duty, failed in their responsibility, both in moral terms and politically, in actually doing exactly what Zola rose up against in his own day, whatever the cost may be, whatever the insults and the defamation, and God knows he suffered that to a point that only a Jew perhaps could understand. I think that today, such voices are few and far between, singularly lacking. And when they are heard and very vocal, they often come from the other side. And I don't want to get into that at this point, what I mean by that. But I wanted to make that statement, and also to quote those immortal lines at the time of Zola's funeral. You remember another great writer in France, Anatole France, was the man who was selected to say words, fitting words, in honor of Zola. And he closed his remarks. Some of you may have seen the Hollywood film from the 1930s, The Life of Emile Zola, but that's how the film ends. He closed Anatole France with the remarks, "Let us envy him, for his destiny and his heart have earned him the highest distinction of all. He was a moment in the history of human conscience." Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Professor Maurice Samuels. He's a professor of French and director of graduate studies at Yale University. However, he's a Harvard man. I don't think I'm revealing any state secrets, but he defected to the other side. Right? He took his BA at Harvard, his MA, and his PhD. And before coming to Yale, he taught at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in the literature and culture of 19th century France and Jewish studies. And I want to mention two books here. The first, called The Spectacular Past, Popular History and the Novel in 19th Century France, which was published by Cornell a number of years ago. And more recently, a book which I've actually read, so I can recommend it, called Inventing the Israelite, Jewish Fiction in 19th Century France. And more recently, he is currently co-editing a reader about 19th century Jewish literature. One other important detail that I would like to mention is that during the past year, Maurice, or Maury as he likes to be known, has been appointed and has been working as the director of the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism. Some of you may have seen here and there in the press and the media various statements, some of them quite dubious to my way of thinking, about the politics and other controversial matters behind the past of that particular institution. What I wish to say is that I'm very pleased to see a real scholar in this position today, and somebody who I think understands very well the delicate balance that we all face in the study of anti-Semitism between past and present. So it's my pleasure.
Thank you. Anyway, it's a great honor to be here in Israel and at the Vidal Sassoon Center, and I'm really very thankful for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. The paper I'm going to be presenting today is from the book that I've been writing for a while on French Philosemitism, so on positive discourse on Jews in France. And when I tell people that I'm writing a book on French Philosemitism, they always joke that it's going to be a very short book. That's what I hear all the time. Unfortunately, it's not. It's turning out to be a very long and complicated book that's taking me a lot longer than I thought to write. But that's a good thing. And the book spans the historical period from the French Revolution to the present. So this talk comes from the middle of the project on the end of the 19th century and the Dreyfus affair. The talk is going to be about Zola, and I'm going to be talking about a different side of Zola, what some people don't necessarily know about him, which is that he flirted with a kind of anti-Semitism. And I'm going to be looking at the relationship between his anti-Semitism and his philo-Semitism. But I'll be happy to answer questions at the end, if you have them, about the Dreyfus affair itself or about other aspects of my project. So, France can lay claim to being the birthplace of modern anti-Semitism. Although the term anti-Semitism was coined in Germany in the 1870s, and it was there that anti-Semitism became a state-sponsored weapon of terror, French thinkers and writers were responsible for some of the key developments in anti-Semitism as an ideology. It was 18th century French Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire who first secularized what had originally been a religious antipathy. It was in France that early socialist thinkers in the 19th century would develop a form of economic anti-Semitism that demonized the Jews as the lords of a new financial feudalism. And it was in France that some of the earliest and most influential theories of race first saw the light. These various currents of Jew hatred came together during the Dreyfus affair of the 1890s, which Hannah Arendt memorably called a dress rehearsal for the Holocaust. But if the Holocaust did not ultimately originate in France, although the Vichy regime gave the Nazis a run for their money, it was because of a strong counter-tradition of French philo-Semitism, which I define as the defense, admiration, or love of Jews and Judaism. Now, like anti-Semitism, philo-Semitism can take many forms, including religious, economic, etc. The main type that has dominated the French landscape and the one I'm going to be talking about today, is the political or universalist form, based on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1789, which, in theory at least, precluded discrimination based on religion or race and legislated equality before the law. It was in the name of these universal principles that France became the first European country to make the Jews citizens in 1790 and 91. And it was in the name of these universal principles that Emile Zola defended Alfred Dreyfus, the Jewish officer wrongly convicted of treason in the 1890s. In what follows, I want to take a close look at the ideology of French universalism and at the writings of Zola, its most famous exponent. Scholars have long recognized that prior to the Dreyfus affair, Zola wrote what can arguably be considered an anti-Semitic novel. Entitled L'Argent, Money, it describes the failed attempt of an ambitious businessman to launch a Catholic bank and his defeat at the hands of his Jewish rivals. Now, according to the conventional scholarly view, Zola turned away from anti-Semitism while writing this novel, and his conversion paved the way for his defense of Dreyfus a few years later. What other scholars have failed to notice or emphasize, however, is that Zola's writing during and after the affair still contains certain anti-Semitic stereotypes and even displays a kind of antipathy to the Jews as a people. So how, I want to ask, does what can only be described as an intense ambivalence toward the Jews change our view of Zola's Philosemitism and of the universalist values that underpin it? I'll suggest that far from representing a departure from or a contradiction of universalism, this latent anti-Semitism in fact constitutes an essential part of it. Let me make plain that my goal is not to belittle Zola's role in the Dreyfus affair, which I see as nothing short of heroic. That the writer was willing to sacrifice his life, his liberty, his fortune, and perhaps even his life. People say that he was possibly poisoned. His chimney was stopped up, and he died of carbon monoxide poisoning, possibly because of his role in the affair. That he was willing to make these sacrifices to save an innocent man, even though this man belonged to a group or race about whom he harbored negative opinions, in some ways, I think, serves to underscore the nobility of his gesture. But this Philosemitism deserves to be analyzed as closely as the anti-Semitism that sent Dreyfus to Devil's Island. How can we hope to combat hatred if we don't understand the mechanism of its refusal? In the larger project of which this paper forms a part, I examine the interaction of Philosemitism and anti-Semitism, which have existed in a complicated dialectical relation in the modern period. And I argue that anti-Semitism cannot be properly understood without viewing it in the context of positive treatment of Jews. Zola represents a particularly important case for understanding this dynamic. His defense of Dreyfus, emblematized by his open letter, J'accuse, is not only the most famous instance of Philosemitism, certainly in French history, possibly in world history, but also a particularly instructive example of how positive and negative attitudes toward the Jews can be intertwined within the thought of a single person. And the case of Zola, I want to argue, remains highly relevant to the fight against anti-Semitism today. For Zola's classic articulation of the universalist model for defending the Jews provides insights into the ambivalence lurking beneath much more recent defenses, including defenses by Jews, that follow in his footsteps. At stake here, then, is not only a better understanding of French attitudes towards Jews at the crucial historical moment of the fin de siècle, but also a better understanding of universalism itself and of its allied ideologies of liberalism, republicanism, and secularism that still today constitute one of the prime bulwarks against racial and religious hatred, not only in France, but in much of the West. The universalist Philosemitism that I see as epitomizing the modern French relation to the Jews grows out of a liberal tradition that first found voice in Germany in the 18th century, when Christian Wilhelm Dohm argued that the Jews were corrupt and degenerate, but that it was the Christians who had made them this way through systematic persecution. If the Jews were moneylenders, it was thus because they were denied access to more noble professions. The standard bearer of this liberal strain of Philosemitism during the revolutionary period in France was a priest from Lorraine named the Abbé Grégoire. He argued before the Revolutionary Constituent Assembly that the key to making the Jews into productive citizens was to treat them fairly and grant them equal rights. And as I said, France did eventually become the first European country to grant the Jews equal rights in 1790 and 91. Grégoire is still venerated by Jews in France, and not just by Jews, although scholars have begun to question his motivations. It's likely, we now think, that the revolutionary priest's ultimate goal in making the Jews citizens was to lead them on the path to Christianity. I think he hoped for their conversion. Not all the revolutionaries who sought to emancipate the Jews, however, were acting out of religious concerns. The Jacobins' main goal in supporting emancipation for the Jews was to turn France into a nation of abstract, homogeneous individuals. Intent on the radical centralization of their authority, these revolutionaries sought to abolish all mediating bodies between the individual and the state, such as the guild system and the Catholic Church, as well as the autonomous Jewish communal structures that had existed for centuries in France and that made the Jews, in the eyes of the Jacobins, seem like a nation within the nation. To these revolutionaries, the Jews could become citizens only if they renounced their communal autonomy and identity. As the liberal Count Stanislas de Clermont-Tonnerre, one of the leading proponents of Jewish emancipation, famously put it in his speech before the Revolution's Constituent Assembly, "We must deny everything to the Jews as a nation and grant everything to the Jews as individuals." And it was on this universalist basis that the French Jews became citizens. Universalism proved very good for individual French Jews in the modern period. Whereas Jews could not sit in the British Parliament until 1858, did not gain civil rights in most of Germany until 1870, and remained technically locked in the ghetto of Rome until 1882, French Jews enjoyed full legal equality, with a few small exceptions, from 1791 on. And more Jews rose to high positions in France in the 19th century than in any other country. While French Jews achieved prominence in banking, business, and the arts, as they did in neighboring Germany, only in France did large numbers of Jews enter the liberal professions and the government in the 19th century. Jews graduated from all the top universities in France starting at the beginning of the 19th century and became professors there starting in the 1830s. 3 Jews were elected to the National Assembly in France as early as the 1840s. And of course, 5 Jews became prime minister in France in the 20th century. If the Dreyfus affair took place in France, it was not only because of a persistent French anti-Semitism, but also because France had permitted Jews to become high-ranking army officers in the first place. As scholars have shown, however, French universalism also had a downside. It often made it difficult for Jews in France to express their Jewish identity in the public sphere. In a nation of supposedly abstract, homogeneous individuals, it was not always easy to affirm solidarity with other Jews or to maintain Jewish communal institutions. In my last book, Inventing the Israelite, I explored the ways that Jewish writers in the 19th century in France struggled with this problem, and I revealed some of the creative ways that French Jews attempted to reconcile their universal identity as French citizens with their particular identity as Jews. But in this paper today, I want to focus on the ideology of universalism itself and to look more closely at some of its internal contradictions. Now, before I turn to Zola, I want to make one last point about French universalism. It was both ascendant and in peril at the end of the 19th century. The Third Republic, which many of you probably know lasted from 1870 to 1940, enshrined universalist values and finally succeeded, thanks in part to mandatory free education, in transforming the bulk of peasants into Frenchmen. That's a title of a famous book. Perhaps not coincidentally, the Third Republic also saw the rise to power of many Jewish statesmen, including Léon Blum, who was the first Jewish prime minister in the 1930s. But this was also a period in which critics of the Republican consensus were growing louder and more violent. Ever since the Revolution of 1789, republicanism had its foes in France, mainly right-wing stalwarts of the old regime who were nostalgic for pre-modern values and hierarchical rather than democratic social structures. They were joined at the end of the 19th century by critics from the left of the political spectrum, socialists who opposed capitalist modernity and the Republican state that made economic liberalism its priority. It should come as no surprise that those who opposed capitalism and the Republic, both on the left and the right, became anti-Semitic, since Jews had been associated with these forms of modernity since the Revolution. Zola's position within this political landscape was a complex one, as I'll try to explain. As we'll see, he shared the socialists' hostility to capitalism, but he was a fervent believer in republican democracy. So he was caught between anti- and philo-Semitic impulses. In the 1890s, Zola was the most famous novelist in France and possibly the world, the father of the naturalist school, which sought to ground traditional realism in the social and biological sciences by tracing the effects of heredity and the environment on human actions. Since the early 1870s, he had been engaged in a gigantic literary project, a cycle of 20 novels depicting the members of a single family across the generations. In addition to showing how various hereditary defects, such as alcoholism, manifest themselves in different ways in different contexts, each of Zola's novels also explores a different contemporary social landscape or institution. He wrote novels about trains, prostitutes, department stores, food markets, artists, government bureaucrats, miners, and loaded them with rich sociological detail, the fruit of rigorous field work, as well as often quite poetic flights of imagination. It is Zola's literary embellishments, I think, that prove especially interesting for the cultural historian, because they often betray the latent political ideologies lurking behind his supposedly objective descriptions. For his 18th novel in the series, which he decided to call L'Argent, Money, and which he published first in serial form in 1890 and then as a volume in 1891, he set out to describe the world of the Paris Stock Exchange, or Bourse. Now, bear with me here as I summarize very briefly the plot of the novel. L'Argent describes the efforts of a wheeler and dealer named Aristide Saccar to launch a Catholic bank, La Banque Universelle, with the goal of investing in the Holy Land. Though not a religious person, Saccar exploits the Catholic angle in order to lure capital from pious speculators, declining aristocrats, and other investors frustrated by the dominance of Jewish bankers, who swarm around the Paris Bourse and seem to control its operations. At first, Saccar's energetic marketing succeeds in boosting the bank's share price to dizzying heights, but soon his overweening ambitions and illegal maneuvers drive the bank to ruin. Its demise is hastened by the efforts of the all-powerful Jewish banker Gundermann, who sees in Saccar a rival and who sells shares in the Universelle short when the bank is vulnerable. Saccar uses the bank's own cash reserves to buy back its falling shares in a quixotic bull, but thereby seals the bank's doom. The novel ends with the total collapse of the bank, its worthless shares bought up by the other Jewish speculators at bargain basement prices, leading to the utter ruin of its many Catholic shareholders. Now, it's clear from Zola's preparatory notes that as he contemplated his novel about the Bourse, he envisioned it also as a novel about Jews. "Don't forget that the Jewish question is at the heart of my subject," he wrote, "because I can't touch money without evoking the role of the Jews, both in the past and the present." That's from his preparatory notes. I would like to pause here to consider why for Zola touching the money question, with the hint of contamination that implies, necessarily entailed discussing the Jews, why the link between the two unsavory subjects seemed so self-evident. As Jonathan Karp has explained, Jews have long offered Christian writers a way to debate the social and political significance of capitalism. This tradition goes back at least to the early modern period, to Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. But with the rise of modern finance capitalism in the 19th century, and with it the rise of a group of very high-profile Jewish bankers, foremost among them the Rothschilds, Jews became a kind of lightning rod for complaints about capitalist modernity, including the rise of individualism, secularism, liberalism, and revolutionary democracy, or republicanism. By and large, those opposed to these forces of change became anti-Semitic. They denounced the Jews as a way to register their dislike for the modernization process. In L'Argent, Zola taps into these fears and hatreds. The novel is filled with anti-Semitic rants that recall the worst invective hurled against the Jews by French proto-socialists such as Charles Fourier or his disciple Alphonse Toussenel, whose 1845 book Les Juifs rois de l'époque, Jews, Kings of the Age, denounced Jews as rootless invaders who had transformed France into their lordly domain. Toussenel's legacy would be revived at the end of the 19th century by the most famous French anti-Semite, Édouard Drumont, whose 1,000-page hate-filled screed, La France Juive, Jewish France, of 1886, decried the Jewish takeover of the nation, and it became a national bestseller. Supposedly, although I've heard this disputed, it was the second best-selling book in the 19th century in France. Zola gives Toussenel and Drumont a run for their money by punctuating his novel with diatribes that make up for in vitriol what they lack in originality. "The empire is sold to the Jews, to the dirty Jews," Saccard fulminates. "All our money is condemned to fall into their gnarled claws." And lines like this abound in the novel. Now, it's true that many of these anti-Semitic rants in the novel are voiced by an immoral character, Saccard. We're not necessarily supposed to identify with Saccard, so they do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the narrator or the author. The above citation concerning gnarled claws, for example, is framed by quotes, making clear that it represents the speech of Saccard, the character. But other moments in the text suggest that the narrator might share at least some of the protagonist's hostility to the Jews, if not in its most virulent form, then in a more subtle but no less insidious variant. When Saccard first approaches the stock exchange in the novel, the Bourse, he sees a group of men whom the narrator describes as, and I quote, "an extraordinary meeting of characteristic noses." And then later as a whole dirty Jewish quarter, toute une juiverie malpropre, he says. These descriptions are not in quotation marks, so they do not represent the speech of the character, although they possibly represent the thinking of the character. That's another possibility. Later, describing the origin of the Jewish banker Gundermann's wealth, the narrator once again comments, I quote, "In less than a century, the billionaire's monstrous fortune was born, sprouted up, overflowed in that family through saving and through lucky turns of events," end of quote. Note here the grotesque natural imagery. The Jew's fortune sprouts up like a mushroom, proliferates like a cancer. Note also the unnatural imagery, the emphasis on the monstrosity of the wealth of Gundermann, whom the narrator refers to as, I quote, "the real master, the all-powerful king, feared and obeyed in Paris and all the world, end of quote, in terms that evoke the monarchical metaphor of Toussaint's The Jews, Kings of the Age. So he's really using the terminology of these very explicit socialist anti-Semites in France. That the novel itself, and not just its protagonist, is anti-Semitic seems to be confirmed by the depiction of its many Jewish characters, who all possess an aptitude for finance that is repeatedly referred to as a racially determined trait, a Jewish flair. As one of the failed stock exchange traders complains, I quote, "You have to be a Jew to succeed at the Bourse. If you're not, no use trying to understand. You'll never have any luck. What a lousy business," end of quote. Once again, Zola puts this theory in the mouth of a character rather than the narrator, and thus allows a degree of doubt to arise as to whether the novel shares this view of a Jewish racial superiority in financial matters. But the plot of the novel reinforces the view that the Jews are genetically programmed to make money. At the end of the novel, after Gundermann has driven the Catholic Bank to ruin, the Jewish characters almost all come out on top, whereas the Catholic characters, for the most part, lose everything they have. Even the pale, consumptive Marxist revolutionary, Sigismund Busch, who's the brother of the most repellent of the Jewish bankers, even he reveals an innate gift for economic calculation that he deploys against the capitalist system dominated by the other Jews. Zola's novel thus presents modernity as a clash between Christians and Jews, and shows how the latter have the upper hand thanks to their hereditary talent for making money. There's nothing very original here. Zola was following the lead of a whole tradition of socialist anti-Semitism in France. And as other scholars have pointed out, he very specifically based the plot of this novel on the real-life story of the Union Générale Bank, founded in 1878 by Eugène Bontou, a former employee of the Rothschilds. The Union Générale would crash spectacularly in 1882 in circumstances very similar to those described by Zola in L'Argent. Once the bottom fell out of the share price, the bank's officers attempted to buy back the shares with company money, losing 100 million francs of investor capital. It reminds us of some of the, the Madoff scandal recently, frankly. In a self-justificatory book published from exile after being sentenced to prison in France, Bontou describes how he saw his bank as an alternative to the German Jewish Party, which he believed controlled most business interests in Europe. To explain the bank's failure, Bontou adopts the rhetorical and historical framework of Toussaint, the socialist anti-Semite, denouncing the Jews as agents of a vast capitalist conspiracy. The Jewish race has long waged a war of conquest, he writes, their simple goal to possess, and I quote, the totality of all the gold and money, end of quote. The fallout from the failure of the Union Générale solidified the anti-Jewish animosity that was building in France at the end of the 19th century and helped furnish Drummond with such a large readership for La France Juive. Indeed, Drummond would make the crash of the Union Générale one of the prime pieces of evidence in his prosecution of the Jews in La France Juive. Zola's very similar decision, and that was 1886, so shortly before Zola began working on L'Argent. Zola's very similar decision to make the crash the central focus of his novel about the stock exchange thus reflects a fundamental link between his thinking and Drummond's, despite their very different politics. For Zola, the story of the Union Générale and Bontou's paranoid self-justification fed directly into his vision of modernity as a clash between Jews and Christians. As a scholar named Grant explains, Zola's original outline for the novel cast Gundermann, the Jewish banker who was modeled on James de Rothschild, as the villain of the piece, despite the fact that Rothschild died in 1868, a full decade before the founding of the Union Générale. Zola's original notes not only make Gundermann responsible for bringing down the bank, but even go so far as to accuse the Jewish banker of betraying France in favor of Germany. Bontu's influence is clear. In this early conception, however, Zola had Saccard triumph over Gundermann and the Jews, thus rewriting history to lend the paranoid and hateful anti-Semite the righteous aura of the victor. By the final version of the novel, Zola had modified his plan. According to Grant, his thinking on the matter apparently began to change after he studied Bontu's trial and after a series of conversations with a Jewish banker named Georges Lévy, who convinced him of the absurdity of blaming a Jewish financial conspiracy for the crash of the bank. In the final version of the novel, Gundermann profits from, but does not provoke, the bank's failure. The Jewish banker is driven not by animus against Catholics, but by a pure desire for profit and the need to eliminate a rival. Gundermann is thus less an agent of Jewish domination than a single-minded logician of finance, motivated solely by the profit motive. Most significantly, I think, Gundermann acts alone in his own individual interest and not in league with the other Jews. He is an individualist, not a conspirator. Although, as we've seen, many of those who profit from the bank's collapse in the novel happen to be Jews, there is no Jewish conspiracy to destroy the Catholics in the novel, whereas the Catholics actually do have a conspiracy to combat Jewish financial influence. For Grant, Zola's decision to depart from Bontu's conspiratorial thesis signifies the beginning of Zola's virtuous trajectory away from anti-Semitism. But I'm not so sure. If during his preparations for the novel, Zola saw modernity as a Manichaean battle between the races, with the triumph of evil Jews over virtuous Catholics, the actual novel depicts this battle in more complicated terms, as an opposition between approaches to capitalist modernity that point toward a useful synthesis. Saccard, the Catholic, represents the pleasures of the capitalist system, its uncontained desires and unbridled lusts. In this, he is the opposite of the Jews in the novel, such as the ascetic Gundermann, who avoids women and subsists on a diet of milk, as well as of Sigismund Busch, the consumptive Marxist revolutionary who wastes away in a monk-like cell. The narrator makes it clear that the sexual excesses of Saccard, the Catholic character, are inextricably linked to his capitalist drive, that one fuels the other. And it is this principle of desire, associated here with the Catholics, that offers an alternative to the cold, hyper-rational capitalism of the Jews. Saccard's passion represents the novel's hope for a future of productive ferment, for a non-Jewish brand of capitalist modernity, such as that called for by Bontu. But Saccard's passion also leads to his downfall. His sexual incontinence will prove not only his undoing, but that of the bank as well. Ultimately, it's a spurned lover of his, the Baroness Sandorf, who reveals the secret of the bank's vulnerability to the Jewish banker Gundermann at the crucial moment, permitting him to capitalize on the bank's weakness to sell its shares. So what lesson about money does the novel ultimately teach, with its representation of the Bourse as a clash between Catholic and Jewish worldviews? In the end, the dispassionate logic of the Jews, the product of their perhaps innate racial capacities, eventually destroys the beautiful dreams of the passionate Catholics. Perhaps the solution for these Catholics, the novel seems to imply, is to learn from the Jews, to combine lust and passion with rationality and cunning. Imagine what great things capitalist modernity might produce, the novel leaves us wondering, if such opposites allied. L'Argent thus does reveal an author in the midst of a conversion of sorts. If Zola began the novel convinced of the dastardly intentions of the Jewish capitalists who control the Bourse, he ended it on a far more ambivalent note. The novel still views the Jews as threatening in their financial savvy, but accords them a certain respect while also exculpating them from the most damning charges of conspiracy. According to Grant and other critics, this dawning enlightenment helped pave the way for Zola's heroic actions during the Dreyfus affair, when the author bravely took up his pen on behalf of the falsely convicted Jew. And yet, a close examination of his writings during the affair once again yields a more complicated picture. So now I'm moving to the Dreyfus affair itself. In his famous open letter, J'accuse, denouncing the vast miscarriage of justice and the cover-up that had sent Dreyfus to prison, Zola forthrightly denounces anti-Semitism as a disease that, I quote, will kill the liberal France of the rights of man if it is not cured, end of quote. A year before J'accuse, however, he defended the Jews in more curious terms. In an article entitled Pour les Juifs, which is translated into English as A Plea for the Jews, published in Le Figaro, so in the newspaper, on May 16th, 1896, Zola takes aim not at the architects of the judicial error or at Dreyfus's accusers per se, but rather at the culture of anti-Semitism brewing in France. He begins the article like this. For a few years now, I have been following the campaign that they are trying to fight against the Jews with a growing surprise and disgust, end of quote. He continues by calling this anti-Semitism monstrous, something stupid and blind, and describing it as a throwback to the religious persecutions of the Middle Ages. One has trouble imagining a more forceful defense of the Jews. So this is real philo-Semitism. Complications arise, however, when Zola explores the phenomenon of anti-Semitism in greater detail. He describes the accusations directed at the Jews for being a nation within the nation, for isolating themselves and forming international links with Jews around the world, and most significantly, for loving money. In less than 100 years, Zola tells us, they have appropriated the nation's wealth, becoming a new kind of royalty. Here we once again see the rhetoric of Toussaint and the mid-19th century socialist anti-Semites, as well as Drumont's vision of a Jewish takeover of France. Surprisingly, however, instead of denouncing these accusations, Zola concedes their validity. It is not surprising, Zola concludes, that the Jews now find themselves the, quote, masters of capital, with, quote, their brains conditioned for financial transactions, the product of centuries of training. The question then becomes, for Zola, how Christians should deal with these financial wizards in their midst. As we've seen, the author had asked a very similar question in L'Argent, which depicts modern capitalism as a battle for supremacy waged by passionate Catholic upstarts against the cold, rational Jewish kings of the stock exchange. I'd like to suggest that the solution Zola proposes in Pour les Juifs help shed light on questions that remain more confused or inchoate in that novel. In the essay, Zola once again depicts modern capitalism as a war between conflicting races, but now he thinks that Christians should have no problem winning. I quote, "What is this? You are more than 200 million Catholics, and they are barely 5 million Jews," end of quote. The Catholic superior numbers should guarantee victory if only they knew how to fight. And fight they must if they hope to regain control of their nation's finances from this nation within a nation, this band of outsiders that has made itself a new aristocracy. It seems to me that the conditions for battle are acceptable, Zola states, in terms that leave little doubt about the bellicose nature of his vision of modernity. Zola had concluded L'Argent, the novel, with the Jews victorious and the Catholics in disarray, driven to despair by the superior abilities of a race that had honed its financial craft over centuries. In Pour les Juifs, he's less willing to accept defeat. Here he proposes a surefire method to beat the Jews at their own game: become like them. I quote, "When it comes to business, why not be as intelligent and as clever as they are?" End of quote. Citing his experience at the Bourse while doing research for L'Argent, he describes the sense of defeatism that had plagued the Catholic stockbrokers. This Zola finds humiliating. Nothing is standing in our way, he argues. If Jews have had centuries, quote, to love money and to learn to make it, we only have to follow them onto the battlefield, acquire their qualities, and then fight them with their own arms, end of quote. We might pause here to consider the strangeness of a call to arms against the Jews in an essay that purports to be a plea in their favor. With friends like this, one might say the Jews hardly need enemies. It's important to recognize, however, that Zola's call for fighting the Jews with their own weapons figures in opposition to what he describes as a much worse alternative, outright persecution. This alternative is worse not only because it's old-fashioned and immoral, but also because it is bound to backfire. Persecution, he explains, only makes the Jews stronger, turns them into more fearful enemies. Better to work within the liberal tradition, to accord the Jews rights and then emulate them. Had Saccard attempted to learn from Gundermann instead of fulminating against him, we presume he might have succeeded in establishing his Catholic bank. But if the Catholics succeed in becoming more like the Jews, what place does this leave for the actual Jews in French society? The answer here is none. Zola makes his vision of a Jew-free future plain. Through tolerance and imitation, the Catholics will succeed in making the Jews obsolete. I quote, "Open our arms wide, realize socially the equality that has been recognized by the code," end of quote. This is the path to overcoming the Jews' domination. Zola's liberal vision also contains a desire for assimilation, in the most extreme sense of the term, which is to say the complete dissipation of Jewish difference. I quote again, "Embrace the Jews in order to absorb them and mingle them into us. Enrich ourselves with their good qualities, because they have some. End the war of races by mixing the races. Push for mixed marriages, leave it to the children to reconcile the parents," end of quote. Zola can advocate intermarriage in the confidence that the Christians' one true superiority, that of numbers, will allow them to dominate the future gene pool. The genetic material of the Jews should be mined for its useful qualities and then discarded. I quote again, "And that alone is the work of unity, humanity, and liberation," end of quote. Now, elements of this supposedly philo-Semitic vision surface in Vérité, in English, truth, Zola's final novel, published posthumously in 1903, so after the Dreyfus affair, obviously. This novel is a transparent transposition of the Dreyfus affair. In place of the Jewish army officer falsely accused of treason, the victim of injustice in the novel is a Jewish schoolmaster named Simon in the small town of Maillebois, accused of murdering a child, his nephew, who had been raised as a Catholic and who lived with Simon following the death of his parents. When the child is found dead, the Jewish teacher comes under suspicion despite a complete lack of evidence against him. Inflamed by a scandal-mongering anti-Semitic press and manipulated by church officials anxious to cover up the possible guilt of one of their own teachers, the crowd of angry townspeople calls for the Jew's head. Like Dreyfus, Simon is sent to a penal colony following his conviction, while his brother David works toward his exoneration. So it's very much like the Dreyfus affair, what happens to Dreyfus. Rejected by the rich Jews to whom he turns for help, David finds his biggest supporter in Marc Froment, a free-thinking Catholic schoolmaster who plays the Zola role. Marc overcomes his latent anti-Semitism to pursue the cause of justice. Marc eventually discovers, through sleuthing about, that the real rapist and murderer is one of the teachers at the Jesuit school. So there's a whole kind of anti-Jesuit thesis here, and slowly manages to convince the citizens of Maillebois of the truth. Like Dreyfus, Simon has a retrial, is once again convicted, and then receives a pardon. So it's exactly like the Dreyfus affair. He only returns to Maillebois many years later after the townspeople take up a collection to buy him a new house as a reparation, once the full extent of the plot against him has become clear. The novel ends with perhaps the most delirious scene of philosemitism in French literature, as the mob that had earlier called for the Jew's death acclaims his return, weeping and throwing bouquets of flowers at the innocent man as they escort him to a house they have erected in his honor. Now, Vérité has received very little attention from scholars, and this no doubt has to do with the novel's many artistic flaws. You were probably able to see some of them from my description. An unrelenting didacticism foremost among them. It's a true ideological novel, or in French we say a roman à thèse. And Vérité marshals its plot and characters in service of a relatively straightforward argument against the church and in favor of secularism and republicanism. The true villains in the novel are the church officials who fan the flames of anti-Semitism and willingly ruin the life of a humble Jew in order to protect themselves from scandal. Along with Simon and his family, who find themselves driven to misery and despair, the victims in the novel are the townspeople who are kept in blighted ignorance by the church and its allies. The heroes, of course, are Marc and his colleagues, who work tirelessly and suffer personally for the cause of truth and justice. On the surface, at least, it seems that the anti-Semitic discourse that abounds in L'Argent is systematically refuted in Vérité, its perpetrators exposed as scheming hypocrites who use Jew hatred as camouflage for their right-wing anti-Republican agenda. Whereas L'Argent and Pour les Juifs had represented modernity as an arena of conflict between Jews and Christians, Vérité recasts the nature of the struggle. Vérité draws the battle line not between the races, but rather between advocates and adversaries of republicanism. On one side is the humble Republican schoolmaster, Marc. On the other are the forces of reaction, the church leaders and the wealthy politicians. The Jews are no longer the enemy, but rather the victims of the latter's efforts to stir up ancient prejudices to win the people over to their side. Here the Jew becomes the very emblem of the revolutionary struggle. The delirious Philosemitism of the novel's end, in which huge crowds acclaim the return of Simon, represents a victory celebration for the Republicans. This new political understanding of anti-Semitism would then seem to mark a definitive evolution for Zola, the positive endpoint of his virtuous trajectory. And yet, once again, a closer examination of the novel once again complicates this picture. On one level, Vérité refutes the anti-Semitism of L'Argent, it's true. On another, it reinforces it in ways that are perhaps more insidious than in the earlier novel. In L'Argent and Pour les Juifs, as we have seen, Zola depicts the Jews as superior financial wizards, endowed with a superiority in monetary affairs against which the Christians cannot compete. They are a practical and shrewd race. They carry in their blood a lust for lucre, a love of money, a prodigious capacity for business, Zola wrote in Pour les Juifs, his article defending the Jews. Vérité seems on the surface to refute this equation of Jews and money by foregrounding a family of poor Jews. This is a first for Zola. Simon the schoolmaster makes a modest salary and seems totally uninterested in money. But it is his wife Rachel's family, the Lehmanns, who incarnate a new type for Zola, the Jewish proletarian laborer. Poor tailors, they live in a squalid house in the dankest quarter of Maillebois. Hunched over their piecework, they have the tortured bodies and melancholy souls of the dispossessed. Indeed, Zola not only describes the Lehmanns as poor, but emphasizes that the vast majority of Jews in France are poor as well. The gold of France which the Jews gorge themselves on, if you believe the anti-Semites, was certainly not piled up there, Mark reflects, upon seeing the sordid dwelling of the Lehmanns. Grant, who I've mentioned before, takes this passage to indicate the completeness of Zola's rejection of his earlier anti-Semitic beliefs. As the narrative progresses, however, the Lehmanns gradually emerge from their impoverished condition. Although immediately after Simon's conviction, they lose the few customers they had at the tailor shop, by the end of the novel, they have achieved a modest prosperity. 20 years after the conviction of Simon, after he has received a pardon, but before his exoneration, their daughter Sarah returns to Maillebois to help her grandfather run the tailor shop. 10 years after that, the establishment has grown too big for Sarah to oversee it, so they become major textile producers. Simon, meanwhile, joins his brother David in the exploitation of a marble quarry after his pardon and amasses, quote, a small fortune. So the stereotype of Jewish business acumen that the novel had seemed to refute, thus in the end proves itself sort of true. This is how it should be, the novel seems to say. It is only natural. Perhaps more significantly, though, Zola once again makes his evil capitalist character a Jew. The immensely rich and powerful Baron Nathan, in Vérité, seems to have stepped out of the pages of L'Argent, and in fact, both are modeled after James de Rothschild. But Nathan is an even less sympathetic character, lacking Gundermann's positive qualities, such as his rectitude. Nathan becomes one of the novel's chief villains, refusing to help his fellow Jew, Simon, in order to further his own political and social interests, or not to compromise them. In Vérité, Zola has begun to see anti-Semitism less as the natural reaction to the Jews' superior skills at amassing money than as a byproduct of capitalism itself. The rich Jew is still the perpetrator of capitalist greed and excess, as he had been in L'Argent, but now the poor Jew is his primary victim. The novel describes Nathan as, quote, now so little a Jew that he has enrolled himself among the most ferocious anti-Semites, and what is more, become a fervent royalist, patriot, and savior of France, end of quote. So what seems to have come to pass in Vérité is the very opposite of what Zola had called for implicitly in L'Argent and explicitly in Pour les Juifs. Instead of the Catholics becoming more like the Jews, adopting their knowledge about money, but purifying it with their noble instincts, the Jews, the rich ones at least, have become more like the Catholics. They have retained their sinister greed, but have now coupled it with a right-wing nationalist anti-republicanism that is also anti-Semitic. In Vérité, Zola subsumes anti-Semitism within the problem of capitalism and its logic of individualism, which always leads to the instrumentalization of the other. I quote, there was no Jewish question. There was only the question of piles of money, poisonous and rotting, end of quote. The only answer to the Jewish question in Vérité is to overcome capitalism itself. This solution, of course, had already been proposed in L'Argent by Sigismund Busch, the consumptive Marxist revolutionary. But in that novel, it never has the lung power to succeed. It's too theoretical and too threatening. In other words, I think too Jewish in that novel. In Vérité, capitalism finds a more formidable foe, Marc Froment, whose name in French means yeast. He promises to begin a process that will allow a new non-capitalist society to rise. Unlike in L'Argent, where the vision of the communist paradise remains theoretical, in Vérité it takes on real contours. The novel finishes decades in the future when Marx's vision has brought about a true transformation of France into a classless society. This vision of a post-capitalist paradise is also very specifically a paradise in which the war between Christians and Jews, which Zola repeatedly showed to constitute the dynamic of modernity, has ceased to rage. And with the end of the conflict between the races, a conflict born of capitalism and individualism and destined to die with it, comes an end to anti-Semitism. The end of anti-Semitism, though, Zola makes plain, also means an end to the Jews. The Jews. Why was he still talking about the Jews? Asks one character at the end of the novel, as the townspeople prepare for Simon's triumphant return. I quote, "There were no more Jews, because henceforth there were only citizens free of all dogmas," end of quote. The vision of a Jew-free republic realizes the Jacobin Universalist dream of a nation of qualityless citizens, free of difference in the eyes of the law and of each other. This revolutionary fantasy, to be fair, is ecumenical. I quote again, "It is about time there were no more Jews, because soon there won't be any Catholics." This is another character predicts. The disappearance of the Jews, in this sense, is ideological. Jews will cease to exist because their religion, all religion, will cease to exist. Once the French replace faith in God with faith in the Republic, all conflict will end. But this utopian vision, in the hands of an author obsessed with heredity like Zola, also spells an end for the Jews as a race or people. As in Pour les Juifs, the novel achieves this disappearance through intermarriage. By the end of Vérité, Simon's descendants have intermarried with Marx. The narrator describes the Jews' grandchildren as, quote, "all this blood which had mixed with the blood of Mark, the most heroic of the martyrs' defenders," end of quote. The fantasy of racial reconciliation called for in Pour les Juifs thus achieves its fictional realization here. You remember from that my description of that essay, embrace the Jews in order to absorb them and mingle them into us. That's what he had argued for. Now, since Simon's descendants have no distinguishing qualities whatsoever in the novel and barely exist as characters, one can only presume that this liberal assimilationist solution to the Jewish question will achieve rapid and complete success. The Jews will have ceased to exist. But what to do with Simon himself? What to make of that older generation, those who suffered anti-Semitism and thus continue to exist as Jews? As we've seen, the end of the novel shows the townspeople welcoming the Jewish victim back in an orgy of contrition and respect. I quote, "They didn't stop cheering and applauding the victim. Glory to the innocent man who almost perished at the hands of the people and who the people can never do enough to repay." End of quote. Now, this is Philosemitism, but it is a Philosemitism without Jews. Or rather, the Jew is welcomed back into the national community, but only as a reminder of past divisions that have been overcome. At the same time that the townspeople herald the Jew's return, they erase his difference, literally bulldozing his family's dark home and replacing it with a new one. Above the doorframe of this new house, they carve an inscription in marble. "To the teacher Simon from the town of Maillebois for truth and justice and in reparation for his suffering," signed by the grandchildren of his tormentors. Now, repentance is a noble sentiment, and one should not look a gift house in the mouth. Zola surely meant this inscribed lodging to signify not only a welcoming of the Jew into the national body, but also to serve as a permanent reminder of the suffering he had undergone. But it is hard not to see this house as a kind of museum display or a cage in the zoo, in which the Jew's difference, which has now ceased to signify for future generations, finds itself confined and labeled, exhibited to all future generations as a sign of what they had overcome. Jewishness thus becomes a symbol of the capitalist order that has been superseded. The Jews' offspring, meanwhile, gladly relinquish the distinctions that made their forebears suffer and that have no positive signification for Zola whatsoever. We must be grateful to Zola, I think, for creating such a stark representation of the ultimate aims of a certain strain of French philosemitism. For we have here a very clear vision of the logic underpinning the French model of liberal universalism. Simon's branded house is a metaphor for this model in the way that it accepts the Jew in theory while annihilating him in practice. We find here the ultimate endpoint of a trajectory that had begun in the 18th century, with the Abbé Grégoire's call to grant the Jews rights as a means of fostering their regeneration, in the terms of the day, along with their eventual conversion to Catholicism. For Zola, the dream is a different one: to convert the Jews and the Christians alike to his brand of secular republicanism, and in the process to dissolve the distinctions of all sorts, economic, religious, and racial, that divide French society. But the result, for the Jews at least, is the same: their disappearance as Jews. There is no space for difference in Zola's utopian vision. I'm getting to the end here. My point is not to label Zola an anti-Semite. His actions prove this was not the case. Rather, I want to make the more subtle argument that his brand of Philosemitism was not incompatible with a certain degree of ambivalence and even antipathy toward the Jews. Moreover, I want to argue that ambivalence was in fact essential to this kind of Philosemitism, that it was in part a drive to make the Jews disappear that led universalists like Zola and the Abbé Grégoire to argue on their behalf. That other famous French Philosemite, the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, noticed something similar. In his famous Réflexions sur la question juive, Anti-Semite and Jew in English, published right after World War II, Sartre devotes a chapter to a figure much like Zola, whom he doesn't name. Instead, he labels him the Democrat. According to Sartre, the Democrat sees all men as abstract individuals, bearing the same rights and unencumbered by any particular attachments and affiliations. I quote, "The individual is only for him a sum of universal traits. It follows that his defense of the Jew saves the Jew as a man and annihilates him as a Jew," end of quote. For Sartre, the anti-Semite's hostility and the Democrat's defense amount to much the same thing as far as the Jew is concerned. I quote again, "He, the Democrat, is hostile to the Jew to the extent that the Jew takes it upon himself to think like a Jew," end of quote. Now, I would maintain that there is a major difference between the Democrat and the anti-Semite, and that hoping for the Jew's assimilation is not the same thing as wanting to kill him. But it must be recognized, as I have tried to show, that Sartre's critique has a certain validity. In place of Zola's brand of assimilationist universalism, Sartre proposes what he calls a concrete liberalism, something akin perhaps to American-style multiculturalism that would urge the Jew to affirm his Jewish authenticity and would require non-Jews to accept him as such. And Sartre, I think, was really one of the first to articulate that point of view. But as other scholars have noted, Sartre himself was not free from anti-Semitism, and Réflexions sur la question juive repeats a host of negative stereotypes of Jews while also denying that Jews had an authentic culture to affirm in the first place. And Sartre doesn't even escape from the call to assimilation he criticizes in The Democrat. His essay, oddly, ends with a call for Marxist revolution, not unlike the one imagined at the end of Zola's Vérité, which would lead to the true end of anti-Semitism because Jews would now voluntarily choose to assimilate. So that's how Sartre ultimately ends, in the same place as Zola. It seems as if France's Philosemites keep getting drawn back into the anti-Semitic quicksand from which they struggle to break free. Where then, I want to ask in conclusion, does this leave the Jews? If even their best friends prove unable to portray the Jew as free of negative stereotypes and to imagine a world that would accept the Jews as Jews, must the Jews then reject their aid? In other words, are the main forms of Philosemitism that the West has advanced so flawed that they constitute more of a threat than a help? I would respond with a qualified no. Jews don't need to reject help, but they need to be aware of and on guard against the motivations of their helpers. I think it's better to accept Philosemitism strategically, which is to say, to take whatever benefits it confers, whether these are equal rights for diaspora Jews or help on the world stage for Israel. Dreyfus could not have been exonerated without Zola's help, that's sure. It would have been foolish to reject it because Zola still expressed anti-Semitic beliefs. At the same time, I think Jews need to understand the motives of the Philosemites and to analyze the ideologies that lie behind their offers of aid. To accept Philosemitism strategically is to do so with open eyes, and even with a willingness to expose hidden patterns of prejudice, even among those who are defending you. For it is only by bringing these repressed animosities out in the open that we can hope to dispel them once and for all. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Maurice for that very lucid, comprehensive, and I think very subtle presentation. I think these are questions that certainly demand serious reflection. We have plenty of time for discussion. I just wanted to make three very quick observations that came to mind while I was listening to you. The first was a witty remark that was made by a well-known German Jewish intellectual during the Weimar years. His name was Robert Neumann. And he said, I'll quote it in German, I think you'll probably understand it. Die Philosemiten sind Antisemiten, die die Juden lieben. For those who are not familiar with, that's not Yiddish, that's German. That Philosemites are anti-Semites who love the Jews. I think something of the spirit of what you said is contained in that. The second observation, having just finished writing a book that just came out now on the left, the Jews in Israel, I was struck by the number of social democrats who at exactly this period of time, when Zola published Vérité, in other words, around 1900, that they were saying almost the same things, except using Marxist jargon. Yeah. That was the only difference. In other words, they were looking forward to the day when the Jews would disappear as a collectivity in a universal, classless society. And they went out of their way, for instance, Karl Kautsky, who was a leading socialist theoretician, to emphasize we consider this to be a painless disappearance. You know, it's not going to be like the extinction of the Red Indians in North America. It's going to be gradual, painless. Obviously, mixed marriage is part of it, and the process of assimilation. So I think this was very much in the air, not only in liberal, but also in socialist circles, and probably has similar sources. And the last observation is more just an image that came to my mind. I was thinking of Zola towards the end, like this large teddy bear who gets his arms around an innocent Jewish victim and hugs him out of a sense of boundless fraternity and you know, welcome to the human race and so on. And it's actually a kind of kiss of death, which is disguising a sort of ethnic death wish. You know, the Jews must disappear, but it's all in the name of humanism, of universal humanism. Of course, that would be unfair to Zola, needless to say. I think you very nicely showed the other side. And now I'm sure you have many comments and questions.
Thank you. Yes, Sheikh. Maybe you can go. Yeah.
This assimilation is something that the Jews themselves wanted. The minute they were out of the ghetto, this was their dream, to marry and to It was not something that the anti-Semites wanted for them. The Jews themselves, and they're doing it today.
Right.
In great numbers in America.
Well, it's interesting, actually. So she said, but assimilation is something that the Jews wanted too. As soon as they were emancipated, as soon as they got out of the ghetto, they couldn't wait to, it's interesting. This is actually a point where I think the French case differs from the German case in many ways. So, that was famously true in Germany, where I think it was Heine who said, you probably know, that the conversion was the entrance ticket to German culture, and many of them converted. In France, actually, interestingly, until before the Dreyfus affair, the numbers of conversions and of intermarriage was very small, actually, which is it's surprising, yes, because France was the country where, in a way, the Jews were the most culturally assimilated or acculturated, but the rates of intermarriage and conversion were very low, and I have the statistics in my book, and it's partially because they didn't have anything to gain from conversion in France. You didn't have to convert to go to university. You didn't have to convert to join the liberal professions, to become a lawyer, to become. So what happened is that acculturated non-practicing Jews married other cultural non-practicing Jews, and that's true. That does start to change a little bit in the 20th century, and the rates of conversion do go up in the beginning of the 20th century. And then, strangely after or maybe not, after the Shoah, you start to see more name changes in France and things like that. So it's a complicated question, but yeah, yes.
I was just thinking what Zola or Sartre, they were Christians.
Yeah.
But just the way you say a Philosemitism.
Yeah.
Were they speaking as Christians or as secular?
No, as secular. I mean, I think both of them, I'm not sure they would have even, called themselves Christian, Catholic in the way. I mean, Zola was very anti-clerical, very against the church. And Sartre was Protestant, actually. So, and had, but not, they both, I think what kind of unites them is this sort of, desire to reject religion, period, which they see as a kind of benighted, retrograde mentality that is complicit in oppressing the Jews. So they weren't speaking from a Christian perspective per se, I wouldn't say, but it's interesting. Yes?
May I ask, if these intellectuals wanted a homogenized French society, were they prepared to fight in terms of other countries also having a homogenized society? Were they prepared to give up being French to be universal?
That's a very good question, right? How far were they willing to go? What would they have thought of, the European Union now? No, I would say that most of them were fervent patriots, although, the true communist ones did support the international and did, but, no, they were French patriots. Yes?
I was just wondering, is anything known of any contact between Zola or any influence by Wagner on Zola? Because you have the same idea which some people want to try and excuse Wagner's famous statement, the solution for the Jews to disappear, Sheretz, as we say, for Wagner, that he only meant assimilation, not destruction of the Jews.
Right.
So,
Wagnerism was all the rage in France, at precisely the time that Zola was writing. So, I'm not surprised. And his, Wagner's on Jewishness and music essay is about French composers. Mainly, it's Meyerbeer or composers in France. I mean, he was a German Jew in France, and Alevi. So, I'm sure that, but there were other people doing this too, I would say. Yes.
I have two questions. The first is, from your account, brilliant.
Thank you.
Would you say, it seems to be that it was to change in his capitalism. Like in the earlier works,
Yeah.
he sees that there can be some conflict beginning on capitalism,
Right.
whereas by the very day, he just argues. So it's just that they represent this capitalist ideal.
Yeah.
And secondly, what is this assimilationist norm that seems to be revealing? Because from what you described, it's just an absence of all distinctive qualities, apart
Right.
from maybe like a belief in democracy, but even that seems to be slightly menacing in Verite, like the crowds and like the harmful.
Right. Okay, so to repeat the question, yes. Okay, so the first part was, and you very correctly, I think, summarized my argument better than I did about that what really changes for Zola is not his view of the Jews, but his view of capitalism, and that he starts to see capitalism as not necessarily this opposition and maybe dialectic leading to a synthesis, but something that needs to be overcome altogether. I think that's true. And then the second part of the question was what did he really envision assimilation to be? Is that what you're saying?
What is this assimilation? Because it's hard to see it as prejudice if he's against all distinctive groups.
Right.
So
Right.
he's envisioning this assimilationist norm, but it's very unclear what it is. And even democracy, which is this very clear Republican trait, seems to be slightly menacing in the account that you just gave.
Right.
Like
So.
the masses, the voice of the people.
Right. So what does he envision the future to be, in a sense? Is it and in a sense, why is it, if he's envisioning all religions to disappear, why is that necessarily, anti-Semitic? And what, so I could say a few things about it. He definitely wants all religion to disappear. But what I think is unique is his attention in that novel to wanting the Jews to disappear as a people and to be very interested in how they will intermarry in order to produce that effect. And he's an author who was very concerned with heredity. I mean, that's really one of his main obsessions. And so, that seems to me a problem in a way, that he's not just interested in the Jews, in Judaism disappearing, he's really interested in the Jews disappearing, I think. And that's one of the things that makes this novel, Verite, which few people have written about, I think very interesting, is the fact that it ends in the future, although it's very vague. I mean, I think that it's a kind of socialist, Republican utopia in the future where there are no more classes and things like that. Interestingly, it wasn't supposed to be, but it wound up being his last novel. So in a way, this is his final word as a novelist. Is this? So
would it be unfair or out of context to ask you to comment, based on your final comments about French philosemitism, to compare it to the support of Israel by the fundamentalists in America?
I'm not an expert on that, but it is troubling. I mean, that is what I was thinking of when I at the end of my paper. There are a lot of, and I don't want to say all of them, but there is a strain of Christian evangelical thinking in the United States that views Israel as instrumental to a plan for the end of days. This is an old millenarian, idea that the Jews have to come back to their homeland first, and I do find that troubling, and I find some of the and it's I think a real question. Well, what should Jews do with that help? I mean, I don't know. I mean, what I was arguing at the end was accept it, but not with your eyes closed. That it's okay to accept it, but I think that we have a right to also talk about it for what it is and why they're, yes.
If you think, let's say, Zola's novels in the 19th century compared to, let's say, the Emancipation of Pinsker and the Jewish state of Herzl, what would you say about that?
Wait, so say that again.
The Jewish state and the Emancipation of Pinsker.
Okay.
And if you make a comparison, because they're dealing with the same kind of issues.
Well, I mean, interestingly, you know, Zola is writing during the very period of the birth of political Zionism, right? So, you know, I mean, Herzl famously, and, you know, do people still believe that it's definitely true that he supposedly had the idea while watching the degradation of Dreyfus? I mean, this is what people say. He was a reporter covering the Dreyfus affair. Yeah, and witnessed the degradation of Dreyfus in the courtyard of the École Militaire, and supposedly said, if this can happen even in France, then the Jews aren't safe anywhere. So that was certainly, you know, that was very much in the air at the time. Yes?
One question and one comment. The question is, when I was listening to your instructive lecture, I was reminded of the famous speech of Max Nordau before the second Zionist Congress in Basel, when he says that the Gentiles granted us only a mathematical equality, but their hearts did not follow through. No. So do you think that Emile Zola fits this description about the heart?
Well, no. I think that he truly believed in Jewish equality. I think he truly believed in the ideal of emancipation for the Jews.
Comment, yes, yeah. Thank you. Now the comment is that I think that about Sartre, I was a little bit puzzled that you say that Sartre explication of the anti-Semite is quite a valid one in his infamous essay. Now I think, and I am teaching this essay, that in this essay Sartre actually is quite anti-Semite. Yeah. Why? Because, I mean, take for example his infamous statement, if there would not be Jews, the anti-Semite had to invent them. Right. Namely, he completely neglected our tradition and heritage, our rich culture, etc. Yeah. And we are what we are because the anti-Semite hates us. Right. So then, and he of course believes in the democratic equation, as you said, etc. So don't you think that there's a kind of a new sophisticated anti-Semite that I can call it the universalist bias? Yes. Namely, by giving the Jews equal grants, they want to take away from us our past, but without past we have no future.
Well, that's exactly my argument. Yes, yeah. Yes, I completely agree, and that's what what I find so interesting. Oh, did everyone hear that? Or okay. So what I find so interesting, and you know, the next. Well, I don't know if it's going to be the next chapter, but I also have a chapter on Sartre. Is that he has this whole chapter, you know, the chapter on the Democrat, the short chapter in that book, which is really a critique of Zola, I think. And he is exposing, and then he falls into exactly the same trap as Zola and of the Democrat Universalists who he's opposing. But I do think that Sartre, despite his latent anti-Semitism possibly, or the anti-Semitic, I mean, Susan Suleiman has argued that that book is not an anti-Semitic book, but it produces an anti-Semitic effect. It has, and certainly, it does in many ways, but he does, I think, propose something useful in that book, which is the idea of concrete liberalism, which is this idea that, as I said, that the Jew should affirm himself or herself authentically, and that others must allow that. Even though then he undercuts it at the end with the part about the dream of the Marxist utopia in the future where they're all assimilate anyway. But I think that that was new and that was useful in Sartre. The problem is he then said, you know, he didn't seem to think that the Jews had any authenticity to affirm. So, you know, the Jew for Sartre, he says, is the man who other men take to be the Jew. So it's possible that for Sartre, what it meant for Jews to affirm their authenticity meant only affirming their absolute negativity and their pariah status, and that, you know, instead of any kind of positive notion of Jewish culture. So,
maybe I'm not sorry. Yeah. I don't know, but when Sartre came to the Yale University in 1956, and came to the Department of Philosophy, he came under a heavy attack from all kinds of scholars there, because of neglecting of our past, etc., etc. And he said that now in this day he really regrets.
He changed. Yes.
And he had to learn about Jews in the Easter,
right?
In the shtetl.
He said it.
Authentic Judaism.
Right. He said at the end that when he was writing it, he actually only knew assimilated Jews, and then it was later his secretary was a Jewish guy named Benny Levi, who really, and so he was, undoubtedly very a friend of Israel's, Sartre. So I mean, it's yes.
I have a question based on two points that you mentioned, and based on your answer, I would have the expounded question.
Okay.
You said your book is already becoming more than you anticipated.
Right.
And I heard something that I wonder if it will go in this direction.
Yeah.
You talked about humanism, and you talked about also in your last statement Christian support.
Yeah.
And certainly today, that the I'll call it the dialectic is continuing, and it's continuing in America.
Yeah.
And Israel tends to be a piece, if not will ultimately become a centerpiece in the dialect. This whole concept of humanism, and exactly who to throw under the bus. So I want to know, first of all, do you see the novel having to deal with that aspect? I suppose paralleling it to what's happening in the current scene.
Yeah.
And if so, then how?
Yeah, not the novel. The book. I mean, my book is mostly focused on the French case, which is a little bit different in a way. But I quite honestly have not written the parts that deal with the recent situation in France, where anti-Semitism has returned in a big way, as we all saw horrifically in the spring with the murder at this school in Toulouse, and I'm interested in how the Jews have been defended and how anti-Semitism has been opposed in the current French climate now. And I'm not there yet in figuring it out. So that's what I'm still trying to do.
The question was when you quoted Herzl.
Yeah.
It sounds like, and I'm sure a lot of people say, well, it's not happening in America and it can't happen.
Right.
If you look a certain way, you can see it unfolding just like
right.
So that's
right, and the whole equation of philo-Semitism changes drastically after the creation of the State of Israel. It means something else, I think, to be to support the Jews in that way. And France has a very, as probably all of you know, a very complicated relationship with Israel. I mean, the perfect example of that is de Gaulle, who at first was was a supporter of Israel, and then because of politics with the Arab world changed in 1967, and he made this famous speech, I don't know if you know, which was, where he called the Jews a people who are sure of themselves and dominate, an elite people sure of themselves and dominating. And that was considered so shocking for French Jews to have the president of the Republic call them a people. It reminded them of being called a nation within the nation. It reminded them of the 19th century anti-Semites. It was against the whole liberal universalist tradition where you never distinguish between French citizens. You never say that these... But then, interestingly, when de Gaulle was questioned about that, he said, no, but I meant it as a compliment. And so that, again, is an example, I think, of how that was a sort of philo-Semitism. I mean, it's complicated, but yes.
I would like to bring a small, generous thing between the wars. The Romanians are a lot of anti-Semitic, and some publicists replied an anti-Semitic article. So the first one, anti-Semitic, replied again and accused me of anti-Semitic, not to say Philosemitic.
Okay.
So the second, Kocha, this is his name, he replied, I think anti-Semitism and Philosemitism is the same absurdity.
Right.
That's why I asked if he was Christian, because he only speaks from a Christian voice.
Yes.
He says he's a universalist, but he is speaking.
Well, you're right, and both he and Sartre does the same thing, that they both talk about us, and they mean they're not talking about the Jews. So he's we French people, and they very specifically are talking about we Christian French people. And this confirms what a lot of French Jews had thought for 100 years, which is that lurking behind the universal was the particular, the very Christian particular. So I think that's true. Yes, yes. I think first.
Okay, we have these have to be the two last questions.
Okay.
Very interesting, but it seems to me that the analysis doesn't really go to the very heart of it.
Okay.
We nearly get to the heart of it when you mention in the play Sakar, the Catholic, who wanted the sexual ecstasies of capitalism against Gundermann, who wanted the ascetic, I put here ascetic moralism.
Yeah.
Is not the heart of anti-Semitism, all through the ages, justice? That we Jews represent a conscience which stops other people that wish to enjoy the joys of Sodom and Gomorrah having their way. Isn't this really why we're hated?
Well, interesting, yes. And also, I think it raises the idea that the Jews are focused on the letter of the law. You know, this is an old, I mean, that you've written about, a lot of people have written about, going back to the birth of Christianity, that they are the spirit of the law. They are love and human, you know, versus the Jews who are focused on narrow, hair-splitting legalism. This is yes. I mean, that is a major issue in that novel, and yes, I think that's good. Okay, last question. You choose.
This is an impossible choice.
How about you? You've already asked one, so let's ask. Okay.
I'm interested about Zola, that he seems to know intimately. I mean, you know, the psychology of Emile Zola. You presented his motivations or his mind in the concept, using the concept of anti-Semitism and Philosemitism, Semitism.
Yeah.
And I wonder if his motivation was not the motivation of a person that is always against the powerful and pro the victims. And we as Jewish people like to see ourselves as victims. I mean, it's the truth, it's the reality, but he seems very much like a person who was for the one that he's a socialist, he's a Republican, he's against the people in power. Here in Israel, if you are, as you are more socialist, you are against the families that hold the money, against the banks, and it's not about anti-Semitism. And once he saw that the ones that are oppressed is a Jewish, he was for the oppressed. So this is the real narrative of his life, and not for the Jewish and against the Jewish.
Right.
It's our wounds that make us judge everything through the lens of, is it against the Jews? Or but it is so provincial, I mean, to take all this Emile Zola.
No, I take your point.
Of who he is, I mean,
yeah, well,
justice at all.
I take your point. I do think that it's valid to look at these questions, given that this was a major issue for him. I mean, the Dreyfus affair was a major turning point in his career, and he did write these two novels that are centrally about the Jewish question. So I don't think that it's wrong to examine how the Jewish question functions in his work, because he made it a very important part of his work. But I do agree with you that that is probably how he saw himself, as defending the little guy, and that's what, you know. But I think at the same time it's interesting, and maybe it's narrow and provincial, but I think it's interesting to look at the fact that as he was writing his novel about the stock exchange, you know, he set out to write a novel about the stock exchange, he wound up writing a novel about Jews. And he very consciously wrote in his preparatory notes that I can't touch the money question, as I quoted this, without touching the Jewish question. So I think that alone is an interesting knot to untie and related to him. But I certainly don't want to reduce his whole life and career, and I tried to, carefully say that I still admire him hugely and think that he was a hero in the Dreyfus affair. But I do think it's legitimate to look at, given that he, was so centrally interested in Jewish questions, to look at that question in him. So I'll stop there.
By the way, I think you do have a point, but after all, this was a lecture specifically aimed at Zola and the Jewish question, and Philosemitism, Anti-Semitism. And secondly, one should remember, despite the fact that Zola will always be remembered as one of the great French writers of the 19th century, actually what really assured his place in history was those last few years and his involvement and his commitment to Dreyfus, for which he probably paid with his life. So that's important. I think that, as you could see, you had the audience thoroughly gripped by this
great
presentation.
Questions, everybody.
You had some very good questions, and lots of them.
Yeah.
In fact, so many that we forced to stop at this point. But I'm very grateful to you, and I think we've all learned from this lecture, and good luck with your book.
Thank you.